Whoa, whoa. You know, you can always tell when the weather has been really kind of crappy lately because I personally start letting things go. Like for instance, me shaving. I just haven't had the desire to like rid my face of facial hair given the temperatures lately. It's just I don't know, just something about that. It just doesn't really appeal to me, even though typically I like to be clean shaven. So my apologies. You have to put up with Grizzly Adams here, but we are off and running in this class. Our 8 week excursion through consumer behavior. We are on module 2, week 2, and this has to do with learning and comprehension. So I put the module up, except for this lecture, of course, on Monday morning, and it's up. So you have kind of a thought piece with regard to learning and comprehension, and also you'll have to submit a discussion board topic, of which I have already completed one as well. I like to keep up with the class as well. All right, guys, let's get into this. Let us get into this. Once again, we're talking about learning and comprehension this week, understanding consumer processing. Let's bite down. First, let me ask you a question. Wait a minute. No. Yeah, let me, wait a minute. What is this? What? Oh, right. I'm sorry. I'm having a tough start here. But let's talk a little bit about what learning and perception is. Learning is basically a change in behavior that results from an interaction between a person and a stimulus. By stimulus, what do we mean? We're talking about like something that a person can react to, something that that comes across the five senses: sight, hearing, smell, taste, and feel. And it's something that results that happens when a person is interacting with some kind of stimulus. It's some kind of change in behavior that happens from that interaction between any person and their reaction with something that they can experience through their five senses. Perception is effectively a customer's awareness and interpretation of reality, right? In other words, the idea that everybody has a slightly different take on what reality really is. I mean, we don't like to think about this because we like to think that we're all experiencing the same reality. But the truth is, our set of our set of experiences, the way our brain chemistry works, the way our body chemistry works, it makes it so that people's perception of things is slightly different. That's why people don't respond to things in the same way. Sure, I mean, you think about like things like roller coasters or scary movies or things that you have a response to, or I don't know, eating haggis or something like that, or the feel of this taste of coffee, right? People have different levels of tolerance towards those things because they have a different level of perception, right? But your perception kind of shapes what you're able to both learn and the behaviors that result from you learning, right? That change in behavior, right? Lastly, sensation is the idea that stimuli is processed by those sensory receptors, right? And the things that you use to sense the world. Eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and skin, right? In other words, once you take in information from those sensory receptors, that is the sensation, right? That because it is processed by your sensory receptors. That stimuli is processed through those stimulatory receptors. What's this picture of? What is this picture of? If you're looking at it quickly, you will say, "Oh, this is a skull," right? I mean, that's what it kind of looks like. But the reality is, no, it's not really a skull. What we're looking at is effectively a lady looking at herself, or perhaps a friend, across a table or within a mirror, right? And how you choose to interpret that really comes down to your level of perception. In other words, is it a woman looking at herself? Is it a woman looking at her friend? And what are they doing, or what is she doing on the table? Looks like there's some cups there. Perhaps they could be drinking something. But then your level of perception goes one further, right? In other words, the idea that whatever it is this one woman or these two women are doing, it contributes it contributes to the notion of there being a skull there, right? In other words, because she's doing that, or they're doing that, it's some kind of behavior that results in, skull is often referred to as an image that represents death, right? So it's something that would really kind of like have to do with, the idea that it could be death related. Okay? Hang on, let me pause this for a second. All right. So let's talk for a minute about what the what the notion is between exposure, attention, and comprehension. And this really represents kind of a scaled approach, right? The first level is exposure. In other words, when you have a stimulus within proximity of a customer so that the consumer can sense it, right? In other words, you bring something around so that the consumer can sense this thing. I was reading about, there's been a lot of business books about Disney World. And Disney World, they had a very impressive idea 60 years ago. The idea was to pump out smells to the crowd so that they would react to the smell, right? In other words, if you pass by a food kiosk, you pump out the smell of French fries. What you are smelling is not the actual French fries. What you are smelling is like is a chemical made in the state of New Jersey somewhere on the highway between New York and Philadelphia. There's a whole bunch of factories like this. And they basically just come out with aromas of things, right? And they find out ways to trying to mass distribute the aroma. You are not smelling the French fries, but being exposed to that stimulus of French fry smell makes you want to buy French fries, right? It's an amazing idea that they had. There's a lot of businesses that do that very thing, right? In other words, they control people with smells or with various tastes, things like that. Another example of exposure is like a lot of these fast casual restaurants, right? The fast casual restaurants, they have made it so that the food you eat is easily chewable and quickly swallowable, if that's a word, right? What they will do is that they will actually go in there and make, like if you order a burger from a mom and pop restaurant, it's going to be delicious, of course, but it's also going to be kind of hard to eat. You don't eat it quickly because you're going to kind of work on that for a while. The digestion doesn't work the same way. But when you go to, I don't want to name any names here, but when you go to Applebee's, right? One thing that they have done is in their food labs, they have made it so that these things are easily, quickly consumable so that you will consume more, right? That's a form of a stimulus, right? That taste or that feel actually is what it is. It's not taste, it's feel, right? The feel is such that you become addicted to the fact that you can eat this thing very, very easily. It's kind of nefarious, to tell you the truth. But that's exposure. Sensation, once again, consumers' immediate response to a stimulus, right? In other words, the thing that you experience as soon as you're exposed to something that hits your sensory receptors, your ears, your nose, your eyes, your skin, your tongue, right? These are the things that you immediately feel as a result. Attention is the second level, right? After exposure, we have attention. And what attention is it's intentional. Attention is intentional, right? It's a purposeful allocation of information processing capacity towards developing an understanding of a stimulus, right? In other words, the idea here is that if you have attention to something, you don't necessarily have the attention for every stimulus that you are exposed to out there. But occasionally, something will grab you in such a way that you have to pay attention to it, and actually, you actually spend time using a cognitive or affective approach. By the way, remember, cognitive means you're thinking, affective means you're feeling, right? Conative, pop quiz. What is conative? That's right. Your behavior. That's about your behavior, right? So yeah, that's a purposeful allocation of information processing capacity towards developing an understanding of a stimulus. The last level is comprehension, right? The idea of comprehension is that you have paid so much attention to a particular thing, you are trying to derive some kind of extant meaning about the information that you receive. This means something, right? Once you comprehend, you're at a position where I not only have paid this attention, but I understand the nature of what I'm actually feeling from this particular stimulus, right? So comprehension effectively is the outcome of learning, right? Once you derive meaning from something that was a stimulus, you now have learning. All right, so 3 levels of thinking with regard to learning, right? You have sensing, organizing, and reacting, right? You know, I guess we've all been in this particular situation that this young lady is in here. She's looking at herself in a mirror saying, what will everybody else think, and does this fit, right? We've all been there because it's tough to make, number one, it's tough to make a determination about yourself, but then it's also, you have to be able to make predictions about what other people are going to find pleasing, right? And so to do that, you're going to have to do a little bit of organizing in your head about the things that you sense about what you're wearing and make some kind of reaction based on about the information that you've organized in your head. So let's look at what those are, right? The phases of consumer perception. Number 1, sensing. Sensing, once again, is the sensation, the immediate response to stimuli that have come into contact with one of the consumer's 5 senses. Grounded cognition is the idea that the bodily sensations influence thoughts and meaning independent of effortful thinking, right? In other words, once you have a reaction to something, you don't necessarily need to put any kind of cognition to it because the cognition, it happens automatically. What happens to your body? It's like they say in that book, the body keeps the score, right? The body keeps the score. You can, you can have something, a reaction to something, and because it reacts to that, you don't have to really think about it too hard. This is not something that I want to really invest in. Think about the young lady trying on her outfit. If she put that outfit on, you ever have this happen? I know I have, where you put an outfit on and just immediately you're like, it's just not fitting you right. And like, oh, I don't want to be devoting myself to this for the day. I don't care about what I look like. I don't care if it really, is supposed to fit. It just ain't hitting me right today. My grounded cognition has done the thinking for me, right? Next level, organizing. Cognitive organization is the process by which the human brain assembles sensory evidence into something recognizable. In other words, we take the information that we have available to us through this stimulus and we make some kind of organizational approach to what's really important about this, right? What's really important? I hate to keep bringing this example up, but me and Porsche, right? Whenever I see someone driving a Porsche on the street, I'm like, look at that. Look at that son of a gun right there. That is a fine looking automobile, right? But when I organize the thoughts about what my next car is going to be, no, it's about moving my family around and moving my dog and, doing things that I, just getting to work every day and not wanting to spend a whole big old ton of money. When I start to organize the thoughts of the thing that hit my senses as a positive thing, that organization leads me to a different way, right? Lastly, the reacting, the end of the perceptual process. It occurs as a response or behavior. In other words, the thing that you do, that actually deciding to change change your outfit, or do something to accessorize your outfit, or choosing to buy a Toyota instead of that Porsche, things like that, right? Occurs as a response or behavior, includes physical and mental process responses to the stimuli encountered, right? In other words, you encounter this thing, it's going to have some kind of physical response to it, right? Like it could be something very simple. If you taste something that you do not like, You're going to have a physical response to it. Probably in terms of your facial expressions, you're going to say, ugh, that's terrible, right? Mental responses, oh, I don't want to buy that again. I don't want to even put that anywhere in my body whatsoever, right? So in other words, that's a response to the stimuli you encountered. Or if it's something you really like, you're going to be like, oh, that was really good. And boy, I can't wait to have some more of that, right? That's a form of you're reacting. All right, so let's think for a minute about morning beverages, right? In other words, the idea that we can assimilate, accommodate, and do a contrast to what we decide to put in our to drink for in the morning, right? Like for assimilation, what's probably the most popular morning beverage that's out there? If it ain't coffee, it's got to be top two, right? Your perception about what coffee is looks very much like this image, right, to the left, right? The idea that you have a product here that not only is the actual coffee that most people imbibe. By the way, what does imbibe mean? Pop quiz. Look it up. Imbibe. Imbibe means drink. But let's move on. Assimilation would be something that it fits the product categories very, very easily, right? This, what we have as an option assimilates very easy to what our mental perception about what that should be. Now, accommodation is something different, right? In other words, accommodation is where there's something changed about the product form factor or the product composition, but it allows us to be able to fit a product category, but we see it differently, right? I mean, I'm old enough to remember when there wasn't any coffee but hot coffee. So imagine my surprise when Starbucks started coming out with coffee that is cold. You guys, if you're young in the class, you're not going to appreciate this, but that was crazy, people. I mean, you talking about like cold coffee? Who would drink that? Who the hell would drink that? Turns out it's delicious, right? But it requires an accommodation to allow us to be able to fit the idea of doing that into something that's in the same vein of coffee, right? What helps us think that, right? Number one, it actually is coffee. Number two, it's going to be in a container like this with a Starbucks logo. That allows us very easily to be able to accommodate to that idea of what we could be drinking in the morning, right? In other words, yeah, it's not necessarily this easily assimilatable version of coffee, but it's something that we can accommodate in our head in terms of what is an alternative. A contrast is something different. A contrast is where the product characteristics, I'm trying to get out of your way here, y'all. The product characteristics are too different to fit a category. I do believe this is either V8 or tomato juice. I want to say it's V8, right? In other words, this is something that we could, drink in the morning. It probably would be very good to drink that in the morning. But in terms of what it is, possible to conceptualize for a lot of people, if they're used to coffee, it's just the product characteristics are going to be way too different. You don't drink that for breakfast, right? Even though maybe you should. Look, pop quiz. Is it okay to drink Diet Coke for breakfast? Inquiring minds want to know, right? It's a caffeine beverage. We know that we have cold coffee. Why not cold cola? Is that an accommodation or is that a contrast? You guys, discuss amongst yourselves. All right. Hang on, I gotta make a stop here. All right, let's continue. So one thing to think about with regard to the use of stimuli is that realistically, there are things that people do to expose themselves to only one or a few distinct stimuli, and they tend to weed out others, right? And this is something that people will do. Like, for instance, Selective exposure is the idea that you only expose yourself to certain stimuli and you do not, you screen out the rest of the stimuli. You're only looking to be exposed to a particular thing, right? So you will use things like, like mechanisms to make sure that you only are exposed to a particular thing. Like for instance, one example of that might be like if like online dating, right? There apparently I was hitched before there was really an online dating, but apparently from what I understand, you can do things like select certain characteristics in people that you only want to see for a potential match. A certain age level or a certain height requirement or something like that. That's like a selective exposure. You're not going to see things that you're not exposed to that particular stimuli you're asking for. That's selective exposure. Selective attention is where you only pay attention to certain stimuli. And people could have other characteristics that are very important in online dating, but you're only going to pay attention to only a certain stimuli, right? Like if you're a lady who wants to have a tall boyfriend, right? I mean, yeah, that's okay to expose yourself or only pay attention to when a man is a certain height. But the reality is that whether or not you have a good relationship with this person is not going to be dependent on their height, right? But you want to be able to say, listen, if they're not that height, I'm not really interested. So something like that would be selective attention, right? Selective distortion is one in which you interpret information in ways that are biased by previously held beliefs. This is something that people do when they already have a schema in their head about how things are, and so that they interpret information in a way that's like kind of biased, right? In other words, if you really like video games from Nintendo and they release a video game that, I'm actually saying this because it actually just happened. They release a video game that is seen as below standard, right? There are people who are such fans of games from Nintendo, they just thought, these bad reviews, they're just biased. They don't even know what they're talking about, right? They're just biased because Nintendo always makes them good games, right? Or if you have if they review a product from Apple that is not so great, like the iPod, what was it? iPod Nano that they had back in the day. I think that was the name of it. But it was not a good product, right? And it really legitimately was not. But people were, by that time, they were just so high on Apple. They were like, no, Apple could never make a bad product. And so they selectively distorted how they interpreted the information about the fact that this product could be improved, right? That's just something that people will do. All right, subliminal processing, right? The idea is that the human brain deals with very low strength stimuli where they will still process things that are very low strength and stimuli, and they will still, the truth of this, the certain stimuli, the strength of that stimuli is going to be below your ability to really perceive it. Good example of this comes from the 1950s with the idea of subliminal advertising. Some of you already know this story, but back in the 1950s, they would run movies in theaters, and they would splice in pictures typically run, what do they run, like 24 frames per second? What they would do was they would splice in 2 frames of like Coca-Cola or 2 frames of popcorn just to see if people would see it and want to be able to buy popcorn immediately or buy a Coca-Cola, just having seen 2 frames of a Coca-Cola or popcorn. Typically, it's found that kind of thing doesn't work, but even if it did work, the question is that unethical to be able to pass messages below people's level of perception? I don't know. I mean, that's on you. There's a lot of things that happen now with subliminal processing of things where they will put imagery in various brand logos or things like that, like the A to Z in Amazon.com or the arrow in FedEx or the mom in Wendy's, something like that, where that's you don't really notice it until really kind of someone points it out to you. And it's like, wow, that's always been there. But if you didn't really notice it, I don't know. All right, so the absolute threshold is the minimum strength of a stimulus that can be perceived. And subliminal persuasion is where there's some kind of behavior change induced by subliminal processing, right? If they actually are able to make it, so that you don't really think about the stimuli you're exposed to because it's a low strength stimuli, but you do have a behavioral change because of that. Marketing tool, not kind of ineffective, right? In other words, people need to be able to process things, to be able to respond to things. All right. So J&D is the just noticeable difference. One stimulus is stronger than another, right? In other words, the idea is where there's two stimuli that's there, but there's one stimuli that comes across as a little bit more noticeable. It's more salient to us, right? One can notice that the two are not the same stimuli. Weber's law is that there's a consumer's ability to detect differences between two levels of a stimulus decreases as the intensity of the initial stimulus increases, right? Let's break that down. Your ability to detect differences between two levels of a stimulus decreases as the intensity of the initial stimulus increases. In other words, if the first time you were exposed to a stimulus is very, very strong, your ability to be able to tell the difference between the first stimulus and the second stimulus is not very great because you started off with a very strong stimulus, right? But if it's something where it's a weak signal versus a stronger signal, then yeah, I mean, you're going to notice that, right? Marketers need to understand that little changes made at a time may be unnoticed by a consumer, right? In other words, over time, you're not going to really notice these changes. But at some point, over time, you're going to say, hey, listen, the product that I have right now is completely different than the one that they used to have, right? Major changes made at once will be noticed. Like they make a big change, they're going to notice things. But little changes to be made over a time, little changes will not be noticed very much by the consumer. But you can see it through historical view. Like for instance, whenever I go and look at like what Big Macs at McDonald's used to look like back in the 1970s or early 80s when I was a kid, it's quite a bit different. It looks quite a bit different than it used to look, right? Because of the fact that, they made little changes over time. And now, you can get a Big Mac and it's not as if I don't enjoy it as much as I did when I was a kid. I probably don't enjoy it as much, to tell you the truth. But the changes that have been made have made me, I don't eat them very often at all. But I mean, when I do have one, it's like, oh yeah, I mean, I kind of put up with it a little bit more. It used to be more delicious, to be honest with you. All right. Implications of the just noticeable difference for marketers who attempt to provide value for consumers is that number one, pricing. Consumers do not perceive small differences in pricing as truly different, right? In a time in which there's a lot of inflation, that this is a difficult argument to make. But the reality is that if they are going to have two different signals for price, one being, maybe a product will go for $4 and the next other product will go for $4.20. People are going to perceive that price difference as truly different, right? Quantity, small differences are not perceived as being different in terms of quantity, right, of a particular thing. Now, the effect of price times quantity, that's going to be a little bit more, more memorable for people. It's going to be quite a bit more noticeable, the price times quantity. But just a change in quantity, small differences in quantity of a particular thing, not perceived as being a lot different. quality, small improvements may not have any impact on consumers at all. And this is something that is something that we have trained ourselves not to believe. The idea that small improvements in quality might not have an impact on consumers because people, they get in a mindset about what a certain self-selection of quality is for a product, and it kind of stays with them. It stays with them, right? I suspect, given the history of the company Hyundai, right? Hyundai, when I was in college myself, when I was an undergraduate student, Hyundai was a brand new manufacturer on the scene, and they were famous for making cars that were very bad. They were very bad. Bad. And today they make cars that are actually rather good. They still have some issues with engines, I've noticed, but they have cars now that are very good. But people in their heads about what Hyundai is, you will see people my age and older, maybe slightly younger, and they have already made up their mind about what Hyundai is, right? They know about what that is, and they're willing to make a determination about the quality of Hyundai, even though over the last 30, 35 years, they have made a lot of small improvements to that car company. And they have, I mean, that's a legitimate car company. It's really quite a good car company. But they made determinations about this stuff a long time ago. All right. Whoops. Another thing about the just noticeable difference concept is that for like small additional purchases that you tack on to a large purchase may not create the perception of increased spending. Matter of fact, speaking of auto dealerships, they depend on this idea, right? The idea that, the additional purchases that you make when you're buying a car, various packages, various add-on features, various extended warranties and things that you can buy. They do not, for a lot of people, they do not create the perception of increased spending when, trust me, you do have increased spending because of that, right? Change in product design. Small changes tend to go unnoticed. You have to be ostentatious with these changes if you want people to really notice them, right? The just meaningful difference is basically, this is the smallest amount of change in a stimulus that would influence consumer consumption and choice, right? In other words, the just meaningful difference is this is the smallest amount of change in a system that will actually affect behavior, right? It would affect behavior because of this particular change. And that, of course, is something that, you can determine through research, but the reality is that just small changes aren't going to really move the needle. You have to be able to at least achieve the just meaningful difference to be able to figure out what's going to actually make them buy more, right? But let's talk for a minute about this, right? And I'm not gonna show you the link that I have here. I think it's on your slides on Blackboard. But let's talk about this for a minute. Let's talk about Mexican Coke. I've been thinking a lot over the last few years about Mexican Coke, about why people have such a doggone fantasy about what Mexican Coke is. Mexican Coke, if you did not know, Mexican Coke does not use high fructose corn syrup, right? HFCS. And the reality about not using HFCS, is there a qualitative difference between Mexican Coke and Coke that, U.S. Coke? Maybe. I mean, people say that it tastes cleaner. It tastes more airy. It tastes, I don't know. But it doesn't taste appreciably different, I wouldn't say, right? Matter of fact, if you gave someone, I mean, you can buy, Mexican Coke at Sam's Club or Costco. It's going to cost you quite a bit of money over U.S. Coke because it comes in glass bottles. That's another thing. Comes in glass bottles, like old school, right? Not plastic bottles, but those old school glass bottles. It comes with the sugar, real cane sugar instead of high fructose corn syrup. But if you blindfolded somebody and said, here's some two soft drinks, you poured in U.S. Coke and Mexican Coke, would they be able to tell the difference? I don't know. Maybe if they had a really advanced palate or something like that, they would be able to say, "Oh, this is Mexican Coke." But when you drink it, it works on me. I mean, I will pay the money for Mexican Coke. I think it's delicious as I'm drinking it, right? But I don't know what it is. I don't know what's about it. If it's our attitude about high fructose corn syrup, if it's really the taste, or if it's the difference between cane sugar, real cane sugar, and high fructose corn syrup. I just don't know. I do not know. Discuss. All right, a few things about memory that we want to be able to touch on. I'm going to take another break here for a second. Hang on. Where are we at? All right, yeah, I need to probably tie this up for today pretty soon here. So let's talk a little bit about the types of memory that exist. The first is the implicit memory, right? Implicit memory is the memory that you have for things that you did not necessarily try to remember, right? In other words, it's things that got into your head, but you weren't trying to make an effort to remember that stuff, right? It creates pre-attentive effects, right? In other words, before you really start paying attention to it, it's already working its way into your memory. One thing that is really good for implicit memory is the use of jingles, right? You guys know there are certain songs, perhaps that commercials play, and they get into your head and they just cannot get out, right? In other words, that really works on your implicit memory. You were not trying to remember that, but because that doggone jingle is so catchy, it just gets in your head, and you're not really even paying attention to it, but you know the jingle, right? I don't want to even put a jingle into your head. I got a few in my head right now, but I will spare you me singing them, because I do not want to pass any kind of these deleterious effects of jingles on to you through this video. Again, pre-attentive effects is learning that occurs without attention. The second type of memory is explicit memory, right? That's memory that develops when a person is exposed to, attends, and tries to remember information, right? So, in other words, this is when you're actually trying to remember something. This is when you're trying to learn information, you're trying to memorize information because you want it to get stuck there, right? So let's talk for a minute about a few effects of memory. The first is the mere exposure effect, right? The idea of the mere exposure effect is that consumers will have a preference towards stimuli that they've been exposed to before over stimuli that they have never seen before, right? In other words, people find it easier to deal with stimuli that they've been exposed to previously. That's like your mind already knows how to process that. So you instinctively find those stimuli to be more attractive. Think about the fact that your first day of class in an in-person class, when you go to class, that can be a terrifying experience. I know for me as a professor, it's always a terrifying experience. You're with all these people. You've never seen them before. The students in the class have never seen each other before, that kind of thing. But over time, it's an amazing thing. You could not really make friends with anybody in the class, but the fact that you see them more makes it easier to go to class. Right? They may not be friends, but you've established a rapport with these folks. And then, you see them in class. Over time, the fact that you've been exposed to these people makes it easier to kind of deal with them. The fact that you've seen them before, right? The same could be said for maybe your family or your very good friends, right? I mean, you tend to, you tend to, be more easy with stimuli that you've been exposed to before, all right? Pre-attentive and used by marketers to improve attitudes marginally, right? In other words, the idea that, you will be comforted by these exposures that you've had before. I guess that's what Apple was using in my discussion board example, right? In other words, the idea that people have been exposed to phones for a long time. They want to be able to use the mere exposure effect to make it so that they're comforted by just a phone. I don't know if that's really successful. Remember, my students at the time, they did not care for it. But that's what a thing, right? Have you ever noticed that a lot of Silicon Valley presentations look very similar? I wonder if this link still works. Yeah, right. In other words, let's take a look here. Oh man, they want me to subscribe, but you know where I'm going here, right? In other words, a lot of these presentations, they always look the same. They always have that informal, black or dark shirt over some black jeans. Like that's what they go with, right? And the reason why is because of the mere exposure effect. A long time ago, Steve Jobs started wearing those kind of outfits, and people thought so much of his Silicon Valley presentations that other tech gurus, they said, we want to be able to borrow from that. We want people to see us the way they saw Steve Jobs back then. And so that's what they've been doing. All right, the mere association effect is the transfer of meanings between objects that are similar only by accidental association, right? We associate things together even though they are not necessarily the same, right? What do I have here? Oh yeah, the mere. I'll post this so you can actually look at this. But the mere association effect in brand evaluations is actually a pretty good paper. I'm going to download this and give it to you guys on Blackboard. Marketers make sure to avoid any potentially negative but unintended associations, right? In other words, when here's an example. When Ford Motor Company, a few years ago, they brought back the Ford Bronco. If you're young, you don't remember this, but there was a guy named O.J. Simpson who was famous for riding around in a Ford Bronco back in the early 90s. Look him up if you don't know who that is. But, like the Ford Bronco was associated and ascribed directly with O.J. Simpson for people of a certain age, right? And when they brought back the Ford Bronco, the day they made the announcement it was coming back was O.J. Simpson's birthday. They weren't thinking about it, right? They weren't thinking about that there was an association there. But a lot of my friends, of people of my age who would remember O.J. Simpson and the things that are associated, they were like, this is a massive error. This is a huge F up. Bringing the Ford Bronco back on O.J. Simpson's birthday, that is crazy. That's unforgivable. That's they weren't thinking about it, but there was an association there that people. This is entirely this car is coming out 30 years after the original one was out. The last one was out, I should say. And, there's no reason to really associate these cars because it's a completely different automobile. But people were just like, oh, Bronco, OJ, oh. If you don't know who I'm talking about, you're going to want to look that up. That's a piece of American history that a little bit tawdry, a little bit meretricious, but it's there. Attention, right? When you think about attention, there are some things that you can give attention to stimuli that are completely involuntary, right? That's attention that is beyond the conscious control of the consumer. Things that happen where you must pay attention. You're not trying to pay attention, but it grabbed your attention. And of course, this happened as often as the result of exposure to surprising or very new stimuli, something that's completely different. You weren't planning to pay attention to this, but your exposure to it was like, oh wow, look at this. And it's likely to trigger an orientation reflex. What is an orientation reflex? It's a reflex that occurs as a response to something that you find to be threatening, right? In other words, because you find something to be threatening, you're going to pay close attention to it out of fear, of some kind of fear that it may attack you or it may, pose some kind of extant threat to you in some way. You're going to have an orientation reflex because, this is something that you might find to be a little bit threatening. So a few factors that will help create attention. The first is the intensity of the stimuli. In other words, the fact that a stimuli might be, much more intense than other stimuli. If it's more intense, you're more likely to pay attention. If there's contrast between two stimuli, if there's a lot of contrast, you can definitely tell through the just noticeable difference that one stimuli is different than another. That's contrast. Movement, when like when stimuli kind of moves a particular way, or it has some kind of like actionability, you're more likely to notice it. You're more likely to pay attention to it, right? Surprising stimuli, again, that orientation reflex is the surprising stimuli, things that you might find threatening, things that you might just find surprising, things that you were not expecting. It grabs your attention, involuntary attention. And the size of the stimuli, in other words, the fact that something might be large in presence, or it might be very, very pungent in terms of smell. It might be garish in terms of how it looks. It might be loud in terms of how you hear it. These things are effectively the size of the stimuli and the level of involvement. In other words, how much you inherently care about this stuff anyway, right? If you're more involved, you're going to be in a position where you would actually be interested in that level of interest, right? All right, that's it for today. I'm gonna pick up some tomorrow evening, and we will continue on with Module 2, Learning and Comprehension. See you then. Bye. Hey, what's wrong with my...